Every year, over 500,000 people are reported missing in the United States alone. In many of these cases, there is often at least some indication as to where the person may have gone, giving authorities a trail to follow. There are those cases, however, where an individual simply vanishes without a trace, in circumstances so bizarre that it is impossible to piece together what happened to them. These are the cases of the people who disappeared off the face of the earth. The vast majority of disappearances happen in secluded areas, where there are no witnesses or security cameras which could give authorities a lead. Without these, it's hard for investigators to put together an accurate timeline of events that would result in the missing person's discovery. However, while rare, it's not impossible for someone to disappear in a busy and populated area. This is exactly what would happen to 19-year-old Jason Jolkowski from Benson, Omaha, on June 13, 2001. That morning, at around 10:15 a.m., Jason would get a call from his boss asking him to come into work early, which was at a restaurant called Fazoli's. While it wasn't his shift, Jason couldn't refuse the extra money, so he told his boss he would be coming in. However, informed him that his car was at the repair shop, meaning he would have to walk the 4 miles from his house to Fazoli's. Because the restaurant was very busy, Jason's boss told him he could arrange for one of his coworkers to come get him. Jason instead decided it would save time for all parties involved if he was just picked up from a halfway point rather than his house. They came to the agreement that Jason would meet his coworker in the parking lot of nearby Benson High Magnet School, where he graduated from only 2 years prior. The school was located just over half a mile away from Jason's residence, and the walk usually took him about 10 minutes, so this greatly reduced the distance he had to travel that day. After ending the call with his boss, Jason would quickly shower and get dressed before heading out the door. As he left the house, he noticed that the trash had already been picked up that morning, so he decided he would take the empty cans back into the garage. This would save his 13-year-old brother Michael some work, as it was usually his job to do so. At around 10:45 a.m., Jason's neighbor, Chester Link, would report seeing him putting the trash cans back and then heading off towards the direction of Benson High. Little did Link know, he would be the last person to ever see Jason Jolkowski alive. At 11:15 that day, Jason's coworker was getting a bit distressed as he hadn't arrived yet, so she drove to a nearby gas station where she would use a payphone to call their boss and tell him about the situation. He told her to wait a bit longer just in case Jason showed up. However, he never did, and she returned to work at 11:30. Jason's boss then called his home phone around this time to find out what was going on, but it was his brother who picked up on the other end. Jason's brother informed him that the last time he saw Jason, he was heading to work. It was at this point that they discovered he was missing. Jason's parents were called at work and alerted about his disappearance shortly after. Police were immediately notified, but because Jason was a teenager, and it's not uncommon for teenagers to run away, they did not begin their official investigation until over a week later. While they wouldn't look into Jason's disappearance for a considerable amount of time, his neighborhood was on high alert upon hearing the news. This makes it unlikely that a perpetrator could have come back and hidden evidence or done anything which would obstruct the case, as they would have been noticed. When police did start looking into the case, however, they would not find anything notable that wasn't already known. In the following weeks after Jason's sudden vanishing, ground searches, mounted searches, helicopters, and infrared technology were used to try and locate him. Hundreds of people were interviewed, and police talked to every house in the immediate area. They also looked into every aspect of his personal life, questioning his friends and going through his computer. Despite this, not a single clue was ever discovered, which could explain what might have happened to him. In every practical sense, it seemed Jason had simply vanished off the face of the earth during his short 7-block trail to Benson High. A 30-year veteran of Omaha PD told Jason's mother, Kelly, that in his whole career, this was the single most baffling case he's ever encountered. In an investigation, it's extremely rare to not find even a single lead after someone goes missing, especially in a busy community where said individual was well known by everyone. Not one person was ever suspected, and authorities never had a person of interest. Police, along with Jason's family and friends, had many questions regarding what happened to him. However, the most obvious one was, how could Jason have possibly gone missing during a 10-minute trip he's made hundreds of times before, while walking through a residential area in broad daylight without leaving a single shred of evidence behind, no less? To answer this question, the first thing police did was check Benson High School's security cameras, as this was Jason's intended destination that day, so it was only logical to see if he ever made it. He never did, and wasn't picked up on any camera in the vicinity, including the nearby middle school's surveillance cameras, which he would have had to walk in front of to get to Benson High. He also couldn't have been on Bedford Avenue, which was the main road he would have had to take to get to the school, as the area was simply too heavily trafficked for no one to have seen him. This suggested to authorities that he must have disappeared somewhere rather close to his house. The first theory was that he was taken by someone in a vehicle shortly after departing. But who could have done this in such an impossibly short time span without causing a scene? Also, what would be the motivation for someone to randomly target Jason? His mother stated that Jason liked keeping to himself and had a very small circle of friends. There was absolutely no one on earth who he had a problem with. Standing at 6'1" and weighing around 180 pounds, it's also unlikely someone would have targeted him for an opportunistic crime, as he would have been very difficult to subdue at his size. And even if someone had taken him, this still doesn't explain how they could have done so without being spotted. Jason's mother told investigators he had a very shy nature due to a learning disability that affected his language skills, so he would have never have gotten into a stranger's car willingly. This means someone would have had to force him into a vehicle, but this is just extremely unlikely given the setting. He was literally in a residential community in broad daylight. There were many houses around and people out and about on their morning walks. If there had been a struggle, someone surely would have at least heard or seen something. This all points to it being someone he knew. But this theory too is hard to accept in this circumstance. Because of his learning disability, Jason was rather introverted and socially awkward, according to his parents. Given this, he would have only gotten into a vehicle with a close friend, not just anybody he knew, especially considering his trip was only 10 minutes. All his close friends and anybody with whom he was close enough to accept a ride from were all cleared as having an alibi, however. Also, if he was picked up, it's likely that it was early on during his trip, because if he was already close to the school, there would have been no point to accept the ride. Police contend that this is what happened as well, but if this is the case, it almost seems impossible that someone Jason knew who wanted to harm him happened to be driving by at the exact same time he would be leaving, unless it was premeditated and they knew where he would be at that moment. The problem with this is, Jason was not even supposed to go into work that morning, so even if someone knew his schedule and was planning on hurting him, there was no way they could have possibly known he'd be making an impromptu trip at that time. The only people who knew about it were Jason's boss at Fazoli's and a coworker who was due to pick him up, but they were both cleared by police as having nothing to do with the incident. Some suggest that Jason may have taken a detour in a vehicle with somebody he knew, and wasn't even on his intended path that day, which is why no evidence was found along it. But those close to him noted that Jason was extremely responsible and punctual. He would never show up late to work, especially considering he had someone waiting on him. They contend that if he did accept a ride, it would have only been to the school and nowhere else, lending further credence to the theory that he vanished somewhere along his usual path that day. Others speculate that there may not have been a car at all, and instead, Jason was lured into a nearby house by a neighbor under the guise of needing assistance. After all, Jason was known for having a kind heart in his community and was very empathetic about the struggles of others. Some believe that a predator in the area might have taken advantage of his kindness to hurt him. While plausible, this theory too is unlikely, because Jason only had 15 minutes to make it to the school. Despite his kind nature, Jason was very punctual, so he probably wouldn't have stopped to help a neighbor if he was pressed for time and someone was waiting on him, as his coworker was. It's also extremely uncommon for a predator to be so brazen. Taking someone in broad daylight while in your own community is possibly the most risky crime one can commit. It's very unlikely for even a known offender to subject themselves to this sort of risk, and there was no one in the area who stuck out to Omaha PD as being capable of such a crime. One final theory proposed was that he may not have been taken at all, and instead, disappeared by choice. A Reddit user by the name of DJG123, who worked with Jason at a radio station which was a part of his broadcasting program at Iowa Western Community College, made a post dispelling this theory, however. When asked if it was normal for someone to just vanish from this area of Benson in the morning, and if she thinks Jason went missing out of his own free will, DJG123 replied the following: "Yeah, it was incredibly rare that he would just vanish. Many people think that he might have known his abductors. Jason wasn't dumb, and he wouldn't just get into a car with a stranger. However, they never found any signs of a struggle in the neighborhood, and nobody heard a disturbance. So it would have to be either an instant knockout abduction so he couldn't fight back, or he went with someone he knew. But he was very responsible and wouldn't have skipped work, so he would have only gone with them for a ride to the school, since he had a ride waiting there for him. By the way, he was horrible at giving directions, so he was meeting the coworker at Benson High School because it was easier. No, not 1 ounce of me thinks he disappeared by choice. Nope, no way." DJG123 went on to talk about how Jason was starting a new job the week following his disappearance at a company called Citel Corp as a service representative, for which he was very excited. He was also passionate about his radio broadcasting career, and he had a promising future in the industry. There was just no reason for Jason to leave of his own accord, leading many in the community, especially those who knew him, to fear that whatever happened to Jason, it was something foul. But what really did happen to Jason Jolkowski on that fateful day? The complete lack of evidence or witnesses leaves us only with mere speculation. But in a case such as this, it's almost impossible to even speculate what might have happened. Some people are of the opinion that Jason might have been involved with something investigators didn't know about, and that's why there were simply no leads. Others think whatever happened to Jason must have been so out of the ordinary that no one could possibly have imagined it. Whatever the case may be, the vanishing of Jason Jolkowski showed investigators in the world that sometimes even your own community could be dangerous. On November 15, 2015, 82-year-old Thomas Messick Sr. was on his annual deer hunting trip just south of Brant Lake in Horicon, New York. Although he was doing something that was so familiar to him, this day was different, as it would be the day he would vanish without a trace, never to be seen again. Early that Sunday, Thomas was with a group of 7, which consisted of friends as well as family members. They were hunting near a small body of water called Lily Pond. They were employing a common trapping tactic referred to as a deer drive, where a party of hunters splits up into 2 groups, one being referred to as drivers, who are responsible for chasing the prey towards the second group, referred to as watchers, who lay waiting for an easy ambush. Thomas Messick, along with 3 older members of the group, were the watchers, and they were arranged in a line formation less than 100 yards apart. That day, the younger members of the group, who were the drivers, noted an eerie silence in the forest, almost like there was no wildlife at all, as they were inching closer to the area where Thomas should have been waiting at his post. When they arrived, however, they would be shocked to discover that he was nowhere to be found. Confused, they searched the immediate area, but could not locate any signs of Thomas. To truly understand why this sudden disappearance came as such a shock to his group, we must know a few things about Thomas Messick first. He served in the U.S. Army as a paratrooper with the prestigious 82nd Airborne Division and was an expert hunter as well as woodsman who had been honing his skills for decades. He also taught hunter and survival training for many years. This level of expertise is really what makes his disappearance stand out, as it's one thing when an untrained person goes missing deep in the wilderness. However, when it's a survival expert with decades of experience who vanishes while in close proximity to his group, the possibilities become far more unsettling. Shortly after his disappearance, the group called forest rangers and searched from 4:30 p.m. until it got dark around 7, at which point half the group stayed to fire their rifles and honk their car horns to attract Thomas to the area, while the rest left the scene and reported him missing to family. The day following, an extensive search for Thomas began, with 13 trained rescue professionals from the Park Service that would be called in to look for him. This was the beginning of the huge effort to find Thomas, lasting several months and involving more than 300 professionals and volunteers on some days, assisted by dogs, divers, and helicopters. More than 15 agencies were involved in his search, one of which being the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group, among many other highly specialized organizations. They never managed to find any evidence which could explain what happened to Thomas, however, including no sign of his rifle or walkie-talkie, which he used to communicate with the other hunters while in the forest. All in all, more than 4 square miles were covered, with a larger area being searched by air with helicopters. Thomas Messick's disappearance is extremely perplexing, considering just how extensive the search for him was. And despite this, not a single shred of evidence was ever discovered. His expertise in forest survival and hunting adds another degree of mystery to this case as well, because it's highly unlikely someone with his level of training would have gotten lost or disorientated. The formal search for Thomas Messick ended on November 26, 2015. However, periodic searches were conducted over the following years using cadaver dogs. They never picked up a scent, and to this day, no evidence has been recovered from the area, as if Thomas simply vanished off the face of the earth. But what could have happened to Thomas Messick? To answer this question, many point to his walkie-talkie as being a crucial clue. He was on the same radio channel as the other members of his group, was well within range of them, and knew how to operate it. If so, why not use it if he was in any sort of distress? Had he suffered some medical issue, injured himself, gotten lost, or simply wanted to leave his post momentarily, he could have easily informed his group. The fact that they never heard a word from him suggests that whatever happened to Thomas may have caught him by surprise. The FBI appearing on the scene was also peculiar in this case. Their investigation was questionable from the start, as the FBI does not usually handle missing persons cases unless a child is involved. A few days into the search, they informed Thomas's wife, Beverly Messick, that, quote, something isn't right with the case, but they don't know what. Those present at the investigation noted, however, that the FBI was being very secretive and seemingly weren't following regular protocol. This sparked rumors that the FBI may have had a hidden agenda they weren't revealing, and that the Thomas Messick case was a part of a larger investigation they were conducting. There are many cases of people going missing under bizarre circumstances in national parks, and some believe the FBI may have a special interest in these instances. 9 days after Thomas Messick's disappearance, a 68-year-old city councilman by the name of Fred Drumm would also vanish under similar mysterious circumstances, merely 40 miles away in Schuylerville, New York. He lived on a rural farm with his wife, and was also an avid outdoorsman like Thomas. Early in the morning of November 24, 2015, Fred's wife attended a banquet and would return home later in the afternoon. When she did, Fred was gone. His car was still parked at the house, suggesting he couldn't have gone anywhere far, but there was still no sign of him. There was nothing stolen and no indication of a break-in either. He also didn't take anything with him, which suggests he left the house in a hurry, or something lured him out and he had no time to grab anything. Following his disappearance, a huge search ensued, using canines, helicopters, and even some of the rescue teams that were involved in the search for Thomas Messick. Despite this, no evidence was ever discovered, and the eventual outcome was the same as Thomas's. Although we may never know for sure if the two cases are related, many pointed out the odd similarities between them. Both men were elderly as well as experienced in the outdoors, and they both disappeared under mysterious circumstances from locations where they were meant to stay put. Some also noted that Fred had access to his home and cell phone, which he could have used had there been any distress, but he never did, drawing a parallel to Thomas Messick not using his walkie-talkie, even though he had access to it. This suggested to investigators that both cases involved an element of surprise. On top of this, the two men disappeared just over a week apart, relatively close to one another. Many believe these two cases had to be somehow related, and the culprit FBI was searching for during the Thomas Messick investigation may have been responsible for the disappearance of Fred Drumm as well. While the FBI could potentially have been investigating something more nefarious, such as foul play, there are too many holes to this theory. There were no signs of a struggle in the area where Thomas vanished, and given that he was a highly trained marksman who was armed at the time, it's unlikely he would have gone down without one. But there were no boot prints, or any sign of another person being at or anywhere near his post. While some point out that Thomas couldn't see out of one eye and had limited use of one of his hands, these ailments didn't cause any problems for him during his day-to-day activities. He learned to live with these issues and always made an effort to be more aware of his surroundings because of them, making it very unlikely that someone could have snuck up on him. Also, someone in his group surely would have heard if there had been a struggle, because they were within shouting distance and that area of the woods is very silent. Even if someone had gotten to Thomas, there is no way they could have possibly disposed of him in the short time frame between the start of the hunt to when his crew members noticed him missing, which was less than 2 hours. There were no tire tracks of any sort, or any unfamiliar vehicles in the area, and there was only one road leading into the spot they were at, meaning the other hunters would have surely heard a car coming in and leaving, which they never reported. The fact that nothing of his was ever discovered suggests he was removed from the area, but how could someone have possibly gotten rid of all the evidence, including Thomas's remains, the large rifle he was carrying, and his belongings, all in a short amount of time, with no vehicle, while being mere yards away from the other members of his hunting party, completely undetected? There was an interesting development in the case when, during an interview, Thomas's longtime friend and hunting partner, Sid Sharp, mentioned an extremely bizarre metallic noise he heard in the forest, around 150 yards away from Thomas on the day of his disappearance. Despite his 5 decades of hunting experience, Sid told investigators that this was a sound he's never heard before in his life, saying, quote, "It'd be hard to explain, but it was different. Something different that I never heard before in the woods. I just can't say what it was, you know?" Many, including Sid, speculate that these two events had to be connected, because it's too coincidental that an expert hunter heard something he's never heard before in the forest, on the same day he experienced something he's never experienced before in the forest, which was the bizarre disappearance of his friend. Strange phenomena like lights in the sky or unknown sounds are frequently reported in national park disappearances, and some believe these may offer an explanation as to what might be happening in these cases. What they are, though, is yet to be explained. Thomas Messick's disappearance puzzles investigators to this day, as there is simply no logical explanation to it, and every theory leads to more questions than answers. If he was meant to stay put at his post that day, why would he have left it? If he did leave his post, where could he have gone? And why not alert his group with his walkie-talkie? How far out could he really have gotten by himself at his age? Had he suffered some sort of sudden fatal incident or succumbed to the elements, how come his body was never recovered? And finally, if foul play was involved, what would be the motive? And how could someone have disposed of him completely undetected without a vehicle? While the full truth may never be revealed to us, someone out there knows something. On May 8, 1965, a 26-year-old ionospheric physicist by the name of Carl Robert Disch would vanish near Byrd Station in Antarctica, where he was working on radio systems for the National Bureau of Standards and Technology. While it might not sound so far-fetched for someone to go missing in a place as inhospitable as Antarctica, his disappearance was as bizarre as they come. At 9:15 that morning, Disch was supposed to be making his way back from the radio noise building he was working at to the propagation laboratory, which was the main station in the complex. For his job, he regularly had to travel the very short distance between these buildings, which was just over a mile, and had done so dozens of times previously. The two structures were connected by a handline, which is a length of rope used to help researchers navigate from one building to the other when visibility is poor due to weather. He was very familiar with this trip, as he had to make it multiple times weekly, and it should have taken him no more than 20 minutes. On this day, however, the clock hit 10 and Disch had still not reached his destination. Concerned, his colleagues decided to assemble a vehicle search party and go out looking for him along his intended route. They found no sign of Disch, but at around 11:30, they discovered a set of footprints over by the radio noise building. This is where his crew encountered their first mystery. Instead of leading south along the handline as was expected, The footprints went west, towards the landing strip where supplies were flown in. It was as if something inspired Disch to change course last second and go another direction. His colleagues followed these footsteps for 4 miles, at which point they abruptly stopped. The crew had to go back to camp and refuel. Other than going the wrong direction, there was something interesting about the footsteps themselves. His colleagues originally speculated that he got lost and went the wrong way, as this would be your first assumption in such a case. However, judging by the spacing between his footprints, his pace was very steady and his steps were consistent, as if he had a clear direction in mind. These weren't the footsteps of someone who was disoriented. They were clearly purposeful. Disch's colleagues knew that he would not have simply walked 4 miles in a straight line going at a steady pace if he was truly lost, so they logically deduced that he must have been walking towards something. It's unclear, however, what exactly it may have been, as nothing was being flown in that day at the landing strip, and there were no unfamiliar boot prints or tire tracks. It was very uncharacteristic of Disch to break protocol the way he did, which means whatever he saw must have intrigued him greatly. After refueling, the team would head back out towards the landing strip and continue the search for another 3 hours. They didn't manage to find any sign of Disch, and by this point, the snow was beginning to cover up his tracks. At 7 p.m. that evening, another team was sent out to conduct an extensive search of the supply line, the emergency Jamesway hut, and the fuel dump area, to no avail. An hour later, all able hands were gathered to form a human chain in order to search from main base all the way down to the landing strip where Disch's steps had disappeared. The floodlights were also turned on all over the station, and flares were fired every 30 minutes to attract him to the area. This continued until visibility became too low for the flares to be effective. The following day, on May 9th, yet another vehicle search party was assembled, which covered a 1-mile wide by 9-mile long area spanning from the base to the landing strip and beyond. They managed to relocate occasional undisturbed tracks which were previously discovered. However, they too lost the trail when the steps seemed to suddenly stop 4 miles southwest of the radio noise building. At 7:40 a.m. on the morning of May 10th, now a significant amount of time after Disch's disappearance, an 8-man search team departed the station to look for him as a last-ditch effort, equipped with 2 vehicles, an emergency hut, and enough fuel as well as provisions to last a week. The search began at the main complex, moving in a southerly direction while making sweeps towards the east and west to cover the most amount of area possible. They went on for 12 miles, marking their path with flags as to not check the same area twice. Still, no more tracks and no sign of Disch. On the 12th of May, the team conducted a search of the northeast and southeast sectors of Bird Station, in case something was missed. More searches were planned in the 2 days following. However, weather conditions made this impossible. By the 14th, a huge area of 35 square miles had been searched in the vicinity. Despite this, Carl Robert Disch was never seen again, and he was presumed dead in the following weeks. While it's not unheard of for people to go missing in areas with extreme weather conditions, there are many facets of this case that just don't make sense. The prevailing theory is that low visibility mixed with unpredictable weather conditions disoriented Disch and caused him to veer off his intended path. This theory, however, doesn't hold up for multiple reasons. He had made the journey between the 2 buildings dozens of times and was intimately familiar with the compound. What could have possibly gone differently this time for Disch to become so disoriented he would go the wrong direction, despite this being a short, routine trip? Even with very low visibility, it would be impossible to miss the handline, as it was right at the bottom of the ladder that takes you into the radio noise building, and you would see it immediately upon reaching the ground. If he did somehow miss the handline, however, this still wouldn't explain why he would walk in a straight line at a steady pace for miles. Had he been lost, it would be very easy to tell in his footprints, as they would be far more irregular. The footprints he left behind clearly indicated he was walking towards something with a goal in mind. This is further proven by the fact that his footprints were still visible an hour and a half after his colleagues first noticed him missing. If they could clearly see Disch's prints that long after him leaving the area, then what could have possibly stopped him from simply tracing them back to the radio noise building if he was disoriented, just as his crew did? To many, this is a telltale sign he wasn't walking pointlessly. He had an objective. This begs the question, however, if it's true that Disch was walking towards something as his footsteps suggested, what could it have been? The anomalies surrounding the case, along with the lack of any concrete evidence, has led many to speculate that Carl Robert Disch was taken. While this theory may be far out there to some, many are convinced it's a possibility due to the abrupt cutoff of Disch's footsteps 4 miles out from the radio noise building. Although skeptics argue that the rest of his prints were covered with fresh snow, and that's why the trail seemed to abruptly end, this wouldn't make sense given the context. How is it possible that the first 4 miles of his trail was clearly visible, even an hour and a half after he disappeared, but the rest was somehow covered up completely, as if it only snowed past the 4-mile mark? This gave rise to the idea that the only possible way his prints could have stopped in such a fashion is if he was lifted off the ground. While far-fetched, proponents of this theory also claim it fits perfectly with the story, suggesting that after radioing his colleagues he would be heading back to the main complex, Disch saw a craft at the landing strip and decided to investigate, which is why he decided to change course last second. Once he got close to it, he was taken. And that's why his footprints went in a straight line at a steady pace before abruptly ending. This theory might also explain what the crew experienced while looking for Disch. It's claimed by multiple sources that during the search for Disch, as well as in the following months, there was a wave of bizarre activity around Bird Station, mostly involving strange lights in the sky for which a source could not be found, and bizarre noises off in the distance. Given that Antarctica is uninhabited and Bird Station was the only research center for hundreds of miles, one has to wonder what could have possibly been producing these bizarre sightings and sounds. What's also interesting about the days following Disch's disappearance, other than the anomalous activity surrounding Bird Station, was the disappearance of his dog, a husky named Gus. The crew speculated that Gus might have caught Disch's scent and went out looking for him, only to encounter the same fate he did, whatever it may have been. Even though the abduction theory could possibly explain the anomalies surrounding this case, many just can't subscribe to such an outlandish idea and instead propose more rational explanations, albeit none of them hold much weight once you look into the facts. One theory is that Disch may have suffered a mental breakdown, as it's rumored that he had been cheated during a card game just moments before leaving the building. Already suffering from the isolated conditions, many believe this could have been the last straw which made him walk out into the wilderness with no intention of ever coming back. But why would Disch do something like this? He was a young and brilliant scientist who was highly trained for Arctic living. The thought of him doing something so drastic over something so simple, such as a card game, just doesn't make sense for someone of his caliber. It also wouldn't explain the abrupt ending of his footprints, or where he could have possibly ended up for no one to find him. An alternate theory states that Disch could potentially have been extracted from Bird Station by the Soviet government using a helicopter, as he may have been an undercover operative for them. After all, this was during the height of the Cold War, and a man with Disch's skill set would have proven extremely beneficial to the Soviet Union, especially in the position he was in, collecting data for a major American institution. At the time, there were many stories of scientists going missing under suspicious circumstances, and there was speculation that these were Soviet agents who were extracted after completing their mission. Some believe Disch could have been one of these scientists who were working undercover for the Soviets. This theory could also explain what he was walking towards, and why his footsteps abruptly stopped, as the gust of air from the helicopter propellers could have moved the snow around and covered up the prints. But this theory, too, isn't without its faults. Bird Station is over 400 miles away from the nearest coastline, and even farther from the nearest complex. Therefore, it would simply be impossible for such a distance to be covered by air, unless the Soviets had a secret base installed nearby that we are unaware of to this day. It's also unlikely a helicopter could have gotten so close to the base without at least someone noticing. 56 years later, we are still no closer to solving the case of Carl Robert Disch than we were on May 8, 1965. Although at first it did seem like an open and shut case of a man who simply got disorientated during bad weather and succumbed to the elements. once you actually explore the facts, you quickly realize that something out of the ordinary happened here. And although we may never know what it is, this case is a stark reminder that sometimes the simple explanation just doesn't work. While we may never know what happened to the individuals covered in this video, we can only hope that one day their families will have closure.